Educational stories self-publicity. One day a Brahmin by the name of Severum asked Birbal for help. He said that his forefathers were great Sanskrit scholars and that people used to respectfully refer to them as Pandaji. He said that he had no money nor need for wealth, he was content living a simple life. But he had just one wish. He wished people would refer to him as Pandaji too. He asked Birbal how he could achieve this.
Birbal said that the task was fairly simple. If the Brahmin followed his advice word for word, this task could be achieved. Birbal advised the Brahmin to shout at anyone who called him Pandaji from now on. Now the children who lived in the same street as the Brahmin did not like him since he scolded him often.
They were just waiting for an opportunity to get back at him. Birbal told the children that the Brahmin would get really irritated if they started calling him Pandiji. So the children began to tease him by yelling, Pandaji, whenever he appeared and, as advised by Birbal, the Brahmin responded by shouting at them. The children spread the word to all the other children in the neighborhood that Severum hated being called Pandaji, so they too joined in the chorus, calling him Pandaji.
After a while, Severum got tired of scolding them, but by now everyone was used to calling him Pandaji. Hence the game was over, but the name stuck.
Poet Raiders. In the town of Agra lived a rich businessman. But he was also a miser. Various people used to flock outside his house every day hoping for some kind of generosity, but they always had to return home disappointed. He used to ward them off with false promises, never living up to his word.
Then one day, a poet named Raiders arrived at his house and said that he wanted to read out his poems to the rich man. As the rich man was very fond of poetry, he welcomed him with open arms.
Raiders then recited all his poems one by one. The rich man was very pleased, and especially so when he heard the poem that Raiders had written on him, because he had been compared with Kubera, the god of wealth. In those days it was a custom for rich men and kings to show their appreciation through a reward or gift, as that was the only means of earning for a poor poet. So the rich man promised Raiders some gifts and asked him to come and collect them the next day. Raiders was pleased. The next morning when the poet arrived at the house, the rich man pretended that he had never laid eyes on him before. When Raiders reminded him of his promise, he said that although Raiders was a good poet, he understood very little of human nature. And that if a rich businessman like him truly wanted to reward the poet, he would have done so the very same night. Raiders had been offered a reward not because he was really pleased or impressed, but simply to encourage him.
Raiders was extremely upset, but as there was nothing that he could do, he quietly left the house. On his way home he saw Birbal riding a horse. So he stopped him and asked for his help after narrating the whole incident.
Birbal took him to his house in order to come up with a plan. After giving it some thought, he asked Raiders to go to a friend's house and request the friend to plan a dinner on the coming full moon night, where the rich man would also be invited. Birbal then asked Raiders to relax and leave the rest to him.
Raiders had a trusted friend whose name was Mayades. So he went up to him and told him the plan. The next day, Mayades went to the rich man's house and invited him for dinner. The dinner had been planned for the coming full moon night. Mayades said that he intended to serve his guests in vessels of gold, which the guests would get to take home after the meal. The rich man was thrilled to hear this and jumped at the offer.
After sunset on the full moon night, the rich man arrived at Mayades' house and was surprised to see no other guests there except Raiders. Anyway, they welcomed him and began a polite conversation. The rich man had come on an empty stomach and so was getting hungrier by the minute. Raiders and Mayades were quite full, as they had eaten just before the rich man's arrival.
Finally, at midnight, the rich man could bear his hunger no longer and asked Maeades to serve the food. Maeades sounded extremely surprised and asked him what food he was talking about.
Then rich man tried to remind him that he had been invited for dinner. At that point Rhades asked him for proof of the invitation. The rich man had no answer. Then Maeades told him that he had just invited him to please him and had not really meant it. He then went on to say that even though they did not do anything good for other people, they also would never try to hurt another human being. He asked the rich man not to feel bad.
At that point Burble walked into the room and reminded the rich man of the same treatment that he had himself meted out to Rhades. The rich man realized his mistake and begged for forgiveness. He said that Rhades was a good poet and had not asked him for any reward. He himself had promised to give him some gifts and then cheated him out of them. To make up for his mistake he took out the necklace that he was wearing and gifted it to Rhades. Then they all sat down to eat a healthy meal. Rhades was all praise for Burble and thanked him profusely. Emperor Akbar also invited Rhades to his court and honored him. The Holy Book. Akbar once called Burble and said to him, "Burble, it is said in one of your Hindu holy books that Lord Vishnu one day heard the agonized cry of one of his elephants and rushed to his aid. Why would a god with so many servants at his disposal, himself rush to the succor of the elephant?" Burble replied, "Your Majesty, give me few days to answer your question." The emperor granted him the request. Burble made a wax model of the emperor's grandson and dressed him up in the grandson's clothes. He then told the servant in charge of the grandson to carry the doll out where the emperor could see him and pretend to fall to the ground and throw the doll into the pond nearby, uttering a cry to draw the emperor's attention. "If you do so, I shall reward you greatly." The servant followed Burble's instruction, threw the doll into the pond and himself pretended to fall to the ground, uttering a plaintive cry.
When the emperor heard the cry and saw his grandson fall into the pond, he rushed and jumped into the pond to rescue him. Burble stepped out of the bushes and lent a helping hand to the emperor as he came out of the pond, asking him, "How did your Majesty jump to the rescue of your grandson when you have so many servants to do this job for you?" For the same reason Lord Vishnu rushes to save whoever seeks his help, because in his eyes all creatures are equally precious.